The Ardennes Forest, December 16th, 1944. A pale sun struggled to rise over a land locked in ice. Every branch, every blade of grass shimmered under a skin of frost. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, the kind of stillness that comes before something terrible. Beneath that frozen calm, an entire continent was holding its breath. The Americans who guarded this quiet sector of Belgium believed the war was nearly over. Hitler's armies were in retreat. The Allies had crossed France, liberated Paris, and now stood poised to strike at the heart of Germany. Christmas was days away. The men on the front talked more about going home than fighting another battle. They called the Ardennes a ghost front, sparse patrols, long stretches of forest and little action. It was the perfect place to rest, or so they thought. At 5:30 that morning, the illusion shattered. The sky turned to fire. German artillery opened up with a fury not seen since Normandy, thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket batteries pounding the American lines. The earth shook. Trees splintered and fell. Men who had been sipping coffee seconds earlier were thrown from their foxholes, ears ringing, faces buried in snow. Through the rolling thunder of explosions came the eerie whistle of incoming shells, each one landing closer, each blast sending shockwaves through the forest. The ground was alive, heaving and cracking beneath the weight of steel. For half an hour, hell itself rained down on the Ardennes. When the barrage finally stopped, the silence was worse. Out of that silence came the rumble of engines, hundreds of them. In a small village called Lanzerath, a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Buch wiped blood from his ears and tried to steady his breathing. His platoon, 21 men and 1 medic, had taken shelter on a ridge overlooking the village. They were part of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Division, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They weren't frontline infantry, they were scouts, trained to observe, report, and fall back. Their orders were simple: watch the frontier and signal any German movement. But this morning, there would be no time to report. The enemy was already coming. Buch crawled to the edge of his foxhole and peered through the trees. At first, he saw only mist, thick, gray, clinging to the pines. Then movement, shadows, dozens of them. German paratroopers, Fallschirmjägers, emerging from the fog in perfect formation. Behind them, more figures, hundreds, maybe more, stretching down the road in an endless column. These were not weary conscripts. They were elite soldiers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, part of Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, the spearhead of Hitler's last great offensive, the Ardennes counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Buch froze. He understood instantly. This wasn't a patrol. This was the beginning of something massive. He turned to his men. "Hold your fire, not yet." They waited, hearts hammering, fingers on triggers. The enemy kept advancing, confident, unaware, marching straight into the kill zone. Buch whispered, "Now." The ridge exploded. The first burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire ripped through the cold morning like a lightning strike. Tracers sliced across the valley. German soldiers dropped where they stood. The snow erupted around them, crimson spreading through white drifts. The paratroopers scattered, diving for ditches and broken walls, firing back blindly toward the ridge. The air filled with the roar of automatic rifles, the cracking of branches, and the screams of the wounded. Buch's men fought with precision. Every shot counted. They had dug deep positions days earlier, foxholes reinforced with logs and snow, perfectly placed for overlapping fire. They were scouts, but they knew terrain. They made the forest itself their weapon. Within minutes, the German advance stalled. Dozens lay dead in the open. The survivors pulled back, shocked. 22 Americans had just stopped a battalion. For a few minutes, quiet returned. Smoke drifted across the valley, blurring the outlines of the fallen. Buch checked on his men. Some were bleeding from shrapnel, One had lost his helmet to a near miss. None wanted to leave. Private Sam Jenkins muttered, "They'll be back." Book nodded. "Then we'll be ready." They passed ammunition down the line, melted snow in their canteens, and waited. At 10 a.m., the Germans returned. This time they came in waves. 2 companies strong, supported by machine guns from the village below. Mortar shells fell among the trees, throwing snow and dirt into the air. The ridge trembled again, but the Americans held their fire until the last possible second. "Wait for it," Boak said through clenched teeth. When the enemy reached the clearing, he shouted, "Fire!" The second assault was even bloodier. The .50 caliber roared again, cutting through men and branches alike. Grenades rolled down the slope, exploding among the attackers. The Germans crawled forward on their bellies, trying to flank, but every move was met with disciplined fire. They couldn't break through. The snow turned red again. By midday, Book's men were running low on ammunition. Their hands were numb, rifles freezing, lips cracked and bleeding, yet they kept firing, 1 bullet at a time, deliberate, relentless. The lieutenant moved from foxhole to foxhole, shouting encouragement. "Keep your heads down! We hold the ridge." He didn't know it yet, but their resistance was rewriting the timetable of the entire German offensive. The 6th SS Panzer Army, meant to spearhead the attack westward, was now hours behind schedule. Hitler's carefully planned surprise was already unraveling, undone by 22 Americans who refused to yield. At 2:30 p.m., another wave came. The Germans tried flanking through the forest, creeping between trees, using smoke for cover. Book's line began to splinter. Communications were down. The heavy machine gun jammed. A mortar shell exploded near the command hole, burying Book under snow and dirt. He clawed his way out, dazed but alive. Private Queen, the youngest in the platoon, fired until his rifle clicked empty. When he leaned up to reload, a sniper's bullet caught him above the eye. He fell backward, lifeless. Book stared, frozen, rage boiling beneath the exhaustion. Still, he ordered his men to keep firing. By late afternoon, the forest was a nightmare. Smoke, screams, shattered trees. The Germans had thrown nearly 500 men against a single platoon and still hadn't broken through. But ammunition was gone, communications were dead, darkness was closing in. Book gathered what was left of his unit, exhausted, frostbitten, nearly out of rounds, and told them to dig in. "We'll hold until we can't." The ridge fell silent again as snow began to fall. Night was closing in over the Ardennes. The ridge at Lanzarote, once a fortress of snow and determination, had become a graveyard. Smoke clung to the trees. The air was thick with cordite and the smell of blood. Lieutenant Lyle Book crouched in his foxhole, his ears ringing, his body numb. The battle had raged for nearly 12 hours. His platoon, 22 men, had faced wave after wave of German paratroopers, and somehow they were still alive, but barely. Their heavy machine gun was jammed beyond repair. Ammunition was down to a few clips per man. Their radio had been destroyed hours earlier. The temperature was dropping fast, below freezing, and their breath hung in the air like ghosts. They had no reinforcements, no contact with command, and 500 Germans still surrounded them. At 4 p.m., a lull settled over the forest. The gunfire faded. The enemy regrouped somewhere beyond the tree line. The men knew what was coming next. The final push. Book crawled between foxholes, checking on his soldiers one last time. Private Sam Jenkins was shaking from cold and shock. "Lieutenant," he said through chattering teeth, "they're bringing mortars now. You can hear them setting up." Book nodded grimly. "We hold the ridge until dark. That's the order." He didn't say it aloud, but he knew what it meant. They probably wouldn't see another dawn. The first shells came minutes later, heavy mortars crashing into the upper slope. The ground convulsed, snow erupting in violent plumes. Book felt the concussion through his chest as one round landed just yards away, showering him with dirt. Shouts echoed through the line. "Medic! Medic!" Their lone medic, Corporal Milch, crawled through the smoke, dragging his kit bag. He patched what he could, shrapnel wounds, concussions, broken bones, but the cold made everything slower, blood thicker. A shell exploded near the jeep that had once held their .50 caliber gun, flipping it onto its side and setting it ablaze. The flames illuminated the ridge in a ghostly orange glow. From below, German voices rose again, shouts, whistles, the rhythmic stomp of boots. They were coming. The final assault began just after 5 p.m. The enemy advanced through the trees in 3 directions, left, right, and center. Buch's men fired what little they had left. Rifles cracked. A single bar barked through the gloom, cutting down silhouettes that appeared between trunks. But the Germans were too many, too well coordinated. Grenades landed among the foxholes, blasting snow and splinters into faces and hands. Buch felt the sting of shrapnel across his arm, but kept firing. "Hold your line! Don't give them the ridge!" he shouted over the roar. But the line was breaking. One by one, his foxholes went silent. Private Queen, the youngest, was hit while reloading, the bullets striking clean through his helmet. Corporal Thomas O'Sullivan disappeared in a cloud of smoke when a grenade landed beside him. The survivors kept shooting, eyes stinging from powder and tears. Still, they refused to surrender. As darkness deepened, the Germans pressed in from both flanks, their machine guns stitching the snow with tracers. The platoon was now completely surrounded. Buch crawled through a shallow trench, clutching his frozen rifle. He found Sergeant Willard bleeding from his leg, trying to bandage himself with his own scarf. "We can't hold any longer," the sergeant gasped. "They're right on top of us." Buch hesitated. The words caught in his throat. He could see movement through the trees. Dozens of figures, helmets glinting in the fading light. He raised his rifle, fired his last round, and shouted, "Fall back! Fall back!" It was chaos. The ridge was overrun in minutes. German soldiers flooded the trenches, rifles and submachine guns at the ready. The few Americans still standing were forced to the ground, disarmed, their hands raised. Buch tried to crawl back toward the command post, but a rifle butt slammed into his head, sending him face first into the snow. For a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes, it was over. The battle that had started at dawn had ended in silence. Only the moaning of the wounded remained. The young lieutenant lifted his head, vision blurred, ears ringing. Snowflakes fell gently over the wreckage, over his men, over the German dead, over the smoking remains of the ridge they had defended all day. The enemy commander, Oberst-Leutnant von Hoffmann, stepped forward, pistol in hand. He stared at Buch, the bloodied, frostbitten American who had cost him nearly a full day of progress. Through a translator, he asked coldly, "How many of you are there?" Buch, still on his knees, managed to speak. "You're looking at all of us." Von Hoffmann studied him for a long moment. Then he lowered his weapon and gave a single nod. He ordered his men to cease fire. The war for these 22 Americans was over. The surviving platoon was gathered on the road, their weapons piled in a heap beside them. German soldiers searched them for maps, radios, and documents. None spoke. As they were marched down into Lanzerath, they passed the evidence of what they had done. Dozens of enemy dead lying frozen in the open. A field that had once been pure white was now scarred with black craters and streaks of blood. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the prisoners passed. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared. Even the Germans seemed unsure how to treat them. A handful of scouts who had stopped 500 men. One officer reportedly muttered, "This cannot be possible." But it was. That night they were locked inside a cold barn, their boots and coats taken, their breath visible in the freezing air. Buch tried to count heads in the dark. 19, 20, 21. One missing. Private Queen. He was gone. The lieutenant sat against the wall, head pounding, heart heavy. Around him his men lay motionless, too weak to speak. Outside, the wind howled through the forest. The same forest they had turned into a fortress just hours earlier. Now it was silent again, hiding the echoes of gunfire beneath a new layer of snow. The Germans believed they had won, but in truth, they had already lost. That single day of resistance, 12 hours of courage and defiance, had delayed the 6th SS Panzer Army long enough to shatter Hitler's timetable. The element of surprise was gone. The Allied command now knew where the blow had fallen. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest American battle of the war, would rage for weeks more, but the road to Antwerp, the road to victory, would never again be within Germany's grasp. All because 22 men refused to retreat. The ridge that had roared all day now lay silent under the moon. The snow, blackened by gunfire, was falling again, gently, almost kindly, as if trying to cover what had happened. 21 men stood shivering at gunpoint. Their faces were hollow, lips blue, eyes dazed from concussion and exhaustion. They had fought for 12 hours, and now the rifles that had once defended the ridge were piled in a heap before them. Lieutenant Lyle Buch stared at the ground. His helmet was gone. Blood matted his hair where the German rifle butt had struck him. He could taste metal in his mouth. Around him his men coughed, groaned, or simply stared into the snow. A German officer stepped forward, tall, severe, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos. It was Oberstleutnant von Hoffmann, commander of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. He studied the young lieutenant in disbelief. Through a translator, he demanded, "Where are the rest of your men?" Buch answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "You're looking at all of us." Von Hoffmann's expression didn't change, but those nearby saw it. A flicker of respect, quickly buried under duty. He ordered his troops to cease fire. The ridge was taken. They were marched down through the village they had defended. Lanzerath was no longer a village, just twisted beams and burning roofs. Horses lay dead in the streets. The once quiet cafe was a skeleton of smoke and ash. The snow was red in places and gray in others. The Germans forced the Americans to carry their wounded as they descended. The locals watched from windows, frightened, uncertain which army would hold their homes by morning. Private Earl Brasse later recalled the sound of boots crunching on ice and the smell of diesel and blood, something he said he would never forget. They were herded into a barn on the outskirts of town. The doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed them. Inside, the cold was suffocating. Their breath rose in pale clouds. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed softly. Buch pressed his back against the wooden wall, his whole body shaking uncontrollably. They had fought all day without food, without rest, and now their victory, if it could even be called that, was a cage. At dawn, the Germans opened the doors and shouted for them to move. The column of prisoners shuffled onto the frozen road, hands on heads, boots soaked through with melted snow. The guards barked orders in sharp bursts of German. The Americans trudged east, past fields still littered with the fallen. Every few miles, Buch glanced back at the ridge. It was shrinking in the distance, a dark scar on the horizon. He thought of Private Queen, the only man they'd lost that day, still up there in the snow. He didn't know whether the Germans would bury him or leave him to the wolves and the frost. The thought hollowed him. By the second night, they were across the border. The Germans crammed them into a farmhouse, 20 to a room. The floor was frozen dirt. A single candle burned. Corporal Milosevic, who had taken shrapnel to the leg, couldn't stop shaking. "Lieutenant," he whispered, "you think they'll shoot us?" Buch looked at him and lied softly. "No, they'll keep us alive. They need prisoners," but he wasn't sure. At dawn, they were loaded onto trucks, bound for Germany. The wind cut through their thin coats like knives. They passed through ruined villages and endless forests. Reminders that the war was devouring everything on both sides. When the trucks stopped, they were marched to a rail yard and packed into boxcars. The boxcar smelled of rust and fear. 40 men crammed inside, standing shoulder to shoulder. The doors slammed shut, sealing out the light. The air grew hot with breath, then cold again as night fell. Someone tried to sing quietly. A few lines of silent night. The melody trembled, then died out. Days blurred together. The train rattled through Germany, its destination unknown. They drank melted snow scraped from the cracks between the boards. When one man collapsed, the others held him upright to keep him from being trampled. Buch counted the stops by instinct. On the 5th, the doors opened. Guards shouted. The prisoners stumbled out into a gray field surrounded by barbed wire. They had arrived at Stalag 12A, a prisoner of war camp near Limburg. Life in captivity was a different kind of battle. The barracks were overcrowded, the food barely enough to survive. The men slept two to a bunk, sharing thin blankets. Lice and frostbite spread faster than rumors. Every morning they lined up for roll call, guards counting, always counting, but even there, discipline endured. Buch still led quietly. He organized the men, encouraged them to trade scraps with other prisoners, to share what little they had. He reminded them that they were still soldiers, not victims. Weeks passed, then months. The Allies were advancing from the west now, the sound of artillery sometimes faint in the distance. Hope began to return in whispers. By April 1945, the war was collapsing. One morning, the guards were gone. The camp gates stood open, swinging in the wind. In the distance, they heard the familiar rumble of engines, American tanks rolling through the fields. Liberation. The men of the 394th WW&R platoon limped out of Stalag 12A as free men. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, some barely able to walk, but they were alive. They had done their duty. When Buch finally returned home to Missouri, the war felt like a dream, too vivid to forget, too heavy to talk about. The newspapers celebrated the victory in Europe, but no one mentioned Lanzarote. No one knew that 22 men had held off 500 Germans and delayed a panzer army. For years, Buch didn't speak of it. Neither did his men. They worked, married, raised families, and buried the memories beneath the routines of peacetime. But the ghosts never left them. When the war ended in 1945, the world moved fast to celebrate victory. Cities cheered, flags waved, and medals were pinned in ceremonies across America. But for Lyle Buch and the surviving men of the 394th I&R platoon, there were no parades waiting. They were home, yes, alive, breathing, free, but their story never followed them back across the ocean. No reporters came knocking, no generals sent letters. Lanzarote Ridge became just another name on a map. The battle reports filed by higher command had marked the area as light resistance. The platoon's stand, 12 hours against impossible odds, was reduced to a few lines of army paperwork, and like so many small miracles in war, it vanished into silence. Buch tried to move on. He was 21, but the war had aged him far beyond that. He married, settled in Missouri, found work in insurance. He kept his uniform neatly folded in a box and rarely spoke about what happened in Belgium. When people asked about the medals on his shelf, he just smiled and said, "Long story." It was easier that way. The men of his platoon scattered across the country. Some stayed in touch, others drifted away, building lives that looked peaceful from the outside but carried invisible weight. On cold nights, a few of them still woke to the echo of machine gun fire and the image of white snow turning red. In the years that followed, historians wrote volumes about the Battle of the Bulge, about Bastogne, Patton's Third Army, and the winter siege that broke Hitler's final gamble. Lanzarote Ridge wasn't even a footnote. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the first crack appeared in the silence. A former intelligence officer reviewing old after-action reports stumbled upon something strange. A single platoon credited with halting an entire German regiment near the village of Lanzarote. He double-checked the numbers. It didn't add up. 22 men, 500 enemies, no reinforcements, no artillery, no retreat. The report sounded impossible, so he started digging. By the mid-1970s, interviews began surfacing. Veterans, locals, even a few German officers who had survived the battle. Piece by piece, the full story came together like a photograph developing in slow motion. Historians realized that the platoon's defense had bought the Allies something priceless. Time. That 12-hour stand delayed the 6th SS Panzer Army long enough for U.S. reinforcements to reposition and for command to recognize the scale of the German offensive. Without that delay, Piper's tanks might have broken through to the Meuse River, cutting the Allied line in half. In short, 22 men had altered the course of a battle that shaped the outcome of the war, and no one had ever told their story. In 1981, almost 40 years after that December morning, justice finally found them. The U.S. Army convened a review board. Witnesses testified, documents resurfaced, commanders confirmed the impossible. The 394th I and R platoon had indeed held off hundreds of German troops, delaying the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. That year, the platoon received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest collective honor in the Army. Buch, still humble and soft-spoken, accepted his Distinguished Service Cross. 3 others received the same. 9 were awarded Bronze Stars for valor. The little platoon that had been forgotten by history became the most decorated American unit for a single action in World War II. Reporters asked Buch what he remembered most from that day. He didn't talk about medals or tactics or the numbers. He said, "The faces. My men, that's what I remember." When asked how it felt to finally be recognized, he smiled faintly and said, "We weren't heroes. We were just doing what we were trained to do." Those words echoed louder than any headline. Decades later, the ridge still stands. The trees have regrown. The snow falls quietly, just as it did that morning in 1944. A small granite memorial rests near the road. It bears 22 names, some still living, most gone. Visitors who find it often stop in silence, not just to honor them, but to imagine the impossible. To imagine 22 men holding back 500 because duty demanded it, because courage, in its truest form, never counts the odds. The story of Lanzerath Ridge is not one of glory. It is one of endurance, of sacrifice, of men who fought when they didn't have to, and who changed history without ever realizing it. In the end, it wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about the quiet kind of bravery that no one sees, the kind that happens far from cameras in frozen forests under gray skies. That's where history is truly written. On a ridge in Belgium, 22 Americans stood alone against 500 Germans. They held for 12 hours through ice, fear, and fire. And when the world forgot them, time remembered.